Hi everyone. So this video is going to cover Latinos, specifically the trends in pluralism post 1965 among the Latino communities. Last time we talked about the Black Power movement and Afrocentrism. We looked at the way in which blacks took a sort of mix of pluralist and separatist sort of strategies in their post 1965 activism. For Latinos, it's a little bit different. They go in a much more pluralist direction, although not exclusively. It is overwhelmingly pluralist. And specifically, the Chicano movement looks really different than a lot of the activism in the black community because it's it's a movement that's much more explicitly linked to the labor movement. There were elements of the labor movement involved in the Black Power movement. Martin Luther King, for example, was a strong supporter of labor activism and unions, but the Chicano movement itself is almost completely interconnected with and intertwined with the California labor movement. So we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. So the Chicano movement, also like the Black Power movement, begins in the 1960s. Their working goals include self-defense and the creation of an independent power base. Also pride in Chicano culture and heritage, as well as resistance to forced assimilation. I think I mentioned in a previous video that Mendez v. Westminster was one of the initial cases before the U.S. Supreme Court in the decade before Brown v. Board of Education. So activism in the Latino community in California was kind of moving in a very, very similar direction in terms of starting to break down the way in which separate but equal as a constitutional doctrine established in Plessy v. Ferguson was starting to get kind of critiqued and dismantled through challenges to those laws and to that precedent. So as I mentioned, the movement is linked really overtly to the labor movement through people like Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta and the United Farm Workers. The agricultural workers in the Central Valley in California were overwhelmingly migrant workers. These were people who had been brought in as seasonal workers going all the way back to the early 1900s, the use of the Bracero program to create an inexpensive labor pool of seasonal migrant labor, which would then be sent back at the end of the season, led to this kind of dependency in the California agricultural industries on migrant labor, and the working conditions, as you can imagine, were not good, right? So extremely exploitative, minimal sorts of concessions and considerations made for this labor pool. And so there was a push, an ongoing push for widespread unionization among these agricultural workers, starting with grape farmers, but also a number of other people who worked in production of almonds and citrus fruits and things like that. So you've got that unionization effort among primarily migrant agricultural workers through the United Farm Workers Union. There was also among Chicano youth, especially in the urban areas, there was a concurrent increasing sense of confrontation and militancy among those young people. And then, of course, the existence and the prominence of the Black Power movement, which was unfolding in the United States at the same time, was providing a model for the for activists in the Chicano movement. This overall push was helped quite significantly and revitalized in many ways by the backlash, by white power antagonism toward Chicano activism. So, the movement that begins in the 70s and the 80s, or begins in the 60s and then flourishes in the 70s and the 80s, begins to get significant pushback from some parts of California society. Two things notably kind of stand out. One is a piece of legislation passed in 1994 called Proposition 187. Proposition 187 prohibited access to non-emergency healthcare, public education, and other services by undocumented migrants. So basically, sort of creating a very clear sense of antagonism and hostility, to which the Latino activists are able to sort of galvanize resistance and increase solidarity within their movement. 4 years later, Proposition 227 changed how students who were classified as LEP, which means limited English proficiency, so people for whom English is a second language. Proposition 227 changed how they would be taught in California public schools. So essentially, what this law did was required almost all courses to be taught in English only. It limited the amount of time that LEP students could stay in special single language classes, like Spanish language only classes, and eliminated most multi-year courses for LEP students. So the idea was that if you were a student with limited English proficiency, you would go through a series of courses through which you would acquire English language proficiency. This law basically kind of does away with that and kind of puts students into a more immersive environment in which, of course, it's much less likely that they're going to succeed. And these are clearly sort of directed and very, very racially motivated sort of attacks on migrants, again, who were a significant chunk of the California labor pool. Right, the state was dependent on this labor, but it was also sort of a very nice pastime for a lot of politicians to sort of beat up on the Latino population in California, especially Southern California, as a way to sort of score cheap and quick political points. And so, not surprisingly, this has the opposite of the effect that was intended. It actually galvanizes commitment to overturning these policies and becoming more politically active and confrontational, both among the migrant community, but also among people who were American citizens, but of Latin American descent. So there were four factors that sort of shape Chicano pluralism, the idea that they want to establish a kind of set of organizations and groups that were sort of under the control of Latin Americans. One, of course, is proximity to the place of origin, right? So the Chicano movement, while it is mostly something happening in the South and the West of the United States, it is also happening in other places. So Chicago and especially New York, that's a function of proximity to Puerto Rico. So Puerto Ricans in the East Coast and the central U.S. were significant drivers of the Chicano movement in those places. Obviously, in Southern California, it's going to be proximity to Mexico. And so this notion of Chicano pride was kind of cross-national or transnational. So that's the first thing. Proximity to place of origin makes it easy for people to feel a sense of shared, shared ancestry, shared ethnicity. Number two, the valuation of cultural identity and the emergence of bilingual education, right? So the idea that Spanish language can be preserved, that Spanish language should be, or Spanish culture should be preserved, and that that Mexican or Puerto Rican or Latino identities were things that people should hold on to rather than give them up in favor of sort of broad assimilation. Also, a third factor that shaped this this particular form of Chicano pluralism was that the Hispanic population is more concentrated, right? Tends to be more urban, tends to be more concentrated in particular parts of the country, makes it easier for groups to form and pool valuable resources. And then finally, of course, the proportion of Spanish-speaking migrants is much larger than other groups, right? This is one of the single largest immigrant groups to the United States. And the number of people in the U.S. who also speak Spanish means that this group has the numbers to sort of sustain a pluralist strategy. One of the most significant efforts to date, I would say, is probably the DREAM Act, which was introduced in 1991. For those who don't know, DREAM stands for Development, Relief, Education for Alien Minors. So the idea that the children of immigrants who were brought to the U.S. With their parents would be given certain resources and access to opportunities as a way of sort of getting them again, not assimilated into American culture, but to have them established as productive members of a pluralist society, right? The idea is that you don't want to isolate or cut these people off. Nevertheless, of course, the white political power structures in California up until the late 1990s, were all committed to sort of finding ways to marginalize and legally oppress or suppress the Latino population. And the backlash, of course, is that today in the early 21st century, the Republican Party in California is virtually non-existent. They really have a difficult time fielding statewide candidates for office. They have a difficult time even at the local level. There aren't a few representatives in the U.S. House who represent the Republicans of primarily Southern California, Orange County, and places like that. But the overall political landscape of California right now is one where Democrats dominate, in part because the largest pool of voters are minority voters, right? California is a majority minority state, and in the late 80s and the 90s, a significant chunk of white California Republicans aligned themselves with these sort of measures and efforts that were sort of perceived to be, I don't even think it's perceived to be, they were kind of objectively hostile to people of Latin American descent and certainly migrants. And as people of Latin American descent have become a larger share of the California electorate, that is showing up in consequences that are probably not surprising to anybody who pays attention to politics. So again, I'd say that you guys should keep in mind the factors that shape the pluralism. You should have some general sense of what the goals of these activist movements were. So the Chicano movement, the Black Power movement, and the American Indian movement, which we'll talk about in a subsequent video. You don't really need to know all of the small moving parts, but it is a fascinating history, and I certainly encourage you guys to pay attention to as much of it as you can. So I think that should wrap us up for this one. I'll say take care and see you next time.